right there.
Cruise into the mystery of the Cutlass. This Oldsmobile ruled the road in the US between 1961 and 1999. But what was its secret? Unveiling it next. If you look at how many Cutlass models were produced in 1967 and 1968, you will be left spellbound. General Motors, the company that makes the Cutlass, built almost 550,000 of them in those 2 years. Yeah, you heard it right. And guess what? Many of these Cutlass had the least expensive engines available. In 1967, the base Cutlass came with a 6-cylinder engine that wasn't very powerful as it consisted of 155 horsepower. But you could also get a Cutlass with a much stronger engine of up to 320 horsepower if you wanted. And that's how the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme got its series status in 1967, as it came with a 330 V8 engine associated with the lineup as a classic offering. And here is some interesting news. Someone is selling a very old and rusty 1967 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme on eBay. The car was found in a junkyard and needs a lot of work to be fixed up again. Even though it's been outside for a long time, all the parts seem to be there. But here is a warning for potential buyers. Don't trust the seller's word alone. Check the car yourself very carefully. Look underneath the car for rust, as you might need to get someone to lift the car up for a good look. The car comes with an engine, as the seller says. It's a powerful 350 V8. It can start and drive, but it likely has rust and other problems you won't know about until you see the car in person. It's hard to say how much of this Cutlass Supreme is still original, but it could be a good car to fix up and use every day. The seller says it runs fine and you don't have to do any major repairs before driving it. A 1967 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme is being sold for $15,000 in Thief River Falls, Minnesota. The seller says the car is in good condition, but it's a good idea to look at it in person before you buy it. The listing says the car runs, but you might still need a trailer to get it home. Now, coming back to why Oldsmobile Cutlass was so popular in those days and why it gained huge sales. The Cutlass started as a fancy version of the Oldsmobile F85 car in 1961. Then, in the 1960s, it became its own car model. By 1976 and 1977, it was the best-selling car ever in North America. The last Cutlass cars were sold in 1999. In 1967, General Motors built several mid-sized cars on the A-body platform. These included the Chevrolet Chevelle and Malibu, the Pontiac Tempest, Le Mans, and the GTO, the Buick Skylark, and the Oldsmobile F85, Cutlass, and 442. Today, only two-door hardtop and convertible versions of these cars are popular for restoring, even if they're in bad condition. Four-door sedans, on the other hand, are less popular for restoration projects. The car has a 5.4-liter V8 engine with 230 horsepower. This engine later became more powerful. The car has a 2-speed Jetaway transmission, which is similar to the Chevrolet Powerglide but different. Originally, most cars came with a 3-speed manual transmission. The Oldsmobile Cutlass started as a small, basic car in the 1960s. It became more popular later in a bigger size. Over time, Oldsmobile made many different Cutlass models. These included muscle cars, luxury cars, and station wagons. By the 1980s, there were many Cutlass cars of all different sizes and styles. Let's take a glimpse at how the journey of Oldsmobile started for its Cutlass models. In 1954, Oldsmobile designed a cool sports car with a powerful V8 engine. It never went into production, but it did share some parts with a smaller car they made later called the F85. Before the F85, Oldsmobile offered bigger cars with names like Series 60 and Series 70, but they stopped making those in the 1940s. In the 1950s, Oldsmobile mostly focused on even bigger cars. When they decided to make a smaller car again, they named it the F85, inspired by a fighter jet instead of using the old series names. They started a trend of Oldsmobile using jet names for their cars. The F85 name also reminded people of Oldsmobile's powerful V8 engines they called rockets. Your minds will be blown to note that the first generation cars were released in 1961, while the second generation models found their launch in 1964. The third generation in 1968, the fourth generation in 1973, the fifth generation in 1978, and the sixth generation found their launch in the market in 1997. Talking about the sixth generation of the Oldsmobile Cutlass, here we go. The Oldsmobile Cutlass came back in 1997. It was basically a Chevrolet Malibu with a few Oldsmobile touches. It only had one engine option and came in two flavors, GL and GLS. You could get some fancy features on the GL, and the GLS came with most of those features already, plus leather seats and a sunroof. This Cutlass was meant to be a temporary replacement for another Oldsmobile car until a new model came out. It ended production in 1999 and was the last car to ever have the Cutlass name. These were built in Oklahoma and not sold in Canada. The Oldsmobile Cutlass was hugely popular in America, selling more cars than any other brand from around 1976 to 1983. It might have lost the top spot once or twice in those years, but it was always a close race. There were many different Cutlass models, including sporty two-door cars, regular four-door sedans, station wagons, and even some unusual four-door cars that looked like a mixture of sedan and a hatchback. The Oldsmobile Cutlass was a very popular car in the late 1970s and early 1980s. There were different versions of the Cutlass, but it's hard to find exact sales numbers for each type. Even without those details, we know Oldsmobile sold a huge number of Cutlasses. In 1977, they sold over 630,000. That's a lot of cars, even compared to popular cars today. In 1980, they still sold almost 500,000 Cutlasses, and sales stayed strong for a few more years. In the year 2020, Mazda sold around 279,000 cars in the United States. Even though Mazda has been around for a while, its sales haven't always been that high. In fact, they only outsold the Oldsmobile Cutlass a few times, and those times were when the Cutlass wasn't selling as well anymore. The Oldsmobile Cutlass, especially the two-door Cutlass Supreme Coupes, used to be really popular in the United States for many years. Some sources say that these two-door coupes were the ones that sold the best. The Oldsmobile Cutlass was a really popular car in America for a long time. From the mid-1970s to the late 1980s, there were two main versions of the Cutlass that sold well. The first one, which is 1973 to 1977, was a bit bigger and curvier. The second one, which is 1978 to 1988, was a little smaller, boxier, and got slightly better gas mileage. Even though the design changed some, both versions were still rear-wheel drive cars with the engine in the front, which was a common design back then. The Cutlass cars looked alright, with some having a cool grille and balanced design, but they weren't that different from other similar cars made by General Motors. Even the most unusual Cutlass design, the Cutlass Salon, had very similar versions in other GM brands like the Buick Century. So, why were Cutlass cars so popular? The Cutlass cars sold really well. Even though it was a time when most GM sedans didn't even have roll-down windows in the back, people bought them like crazy. The Cutlass's peak sales were during the gas crisis of the late 70s and early 80s. That might seem strange because it was a big, old-fashioned car with a powerful engine, not exactly what you would expect to be popular then. Advertisements promised the V8 engine could get good gas mileage, but that was probably unrealistic. You'd likely need to drive very carefully and slowly to get those numbers. The Cutlass came in sporty versions, but most people bought the regular models. They weren't especially powerful or unique compared to other American cars at the time, even though some Fords such as Fairmont, Granada, LTD, and Chrysler's Valiant seemed more modern, they couldn't beat the Cutlass's sales for several years. The Cutlass wasn't the most advanced car, but it was still the most popular. If you liked watching our informative video, click on like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more latest interesting updates.